The silence in the military training facility was deafening. 250 of the world's most elite Special Forces operatives sat frozen in their seats, watching something none of them had ever witnessed before. A woman barely 5'4" inches tall stood over a 6'2" Navy SEAL who lay flat on his back, gasping for air. The cocky smirk that had been plastered across his face just seconds earlier was now replaced by shock and embarrassment. What had started as a routine demonstration of combat techniques had just turned into the most talked-about moment in the facility's 20-year history. The SEAL, who had been bragging about his invincibility just minutes before, now stared up at the ceiling trying to process what had just happened. The woman above him wasn't even breathing hard. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here, not in front of everyone, and definitely not to him. But it did happen, and it would change everything, not just for the humbled SEAL lying on the mat, but for every person in that room who had just witnessed the impossible become reality. This is the story of how one woman shattered expectations, broke barriers, and proved that sometimes the most dangerous opponents come in the smallest packages. Sarah Martinez had always been different, but she never let that stop her. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she was the girl who climbed the tallest trees while other kids played with dolls. She was the one who asked her father to teach her how to change a car tire instead of how to braid her hair. Her mother often worried about Sarah's tomboyish nature, but her father, a former Marine, saw something special in his daughter's fierce determination. When Sarah turned 18, she shocked everyone by announcing her decision to join the military. Her high school counselor tried to steer her toward college. Her mother cried for 3 days straight, and her friends thought she had lost her mind. But Sarah had made up her mind long before graduation day. She had spent years watching documentaries about military operations, reading books about strategy and combat, and training her body to be stronger than anyone expected. Basic training was brutal, but Sarah thrived in ways that surprised even her drill sergeants. While other recruits complained about the early morning runs, she was already awake, doing extra push-ups in the barracks. When others struggled with the obstacle courses, she was helping slower teammates get over the walls. Her instructors noticed something unique about her approach to training. She didn't just follow orders. She studied them, understood them, and then executed them with precision that bordered on artistic. After completing her initial military training with honors, Sarah specialized in hand-to-hand combat and tactical operations. She spent countless hours in the gym, not just building muscle, but understanding the mechanics of human movement. She studied anatomy books to learn pressure points, watched footage of martial arts masters to understand leverage and timing, and practiced techniques until they became second nature. Her small stature, which many saw as a disadvantage, became her greatest asset. She learned to use an opponent's size and strength against them. Years passed, and Sarah's reputation began to grow within military circles. She earned respect through action, not words. During a deployment overseas, she had successfully neutralized 3 enemy combatants who had ambushed her unit. Using nothing but her combat training and quick thinking, the story spread through the ranks, though many who heard it secondhand assumed it had been exaggerated. How could a woman barely over 5 feet tall take down trained fighters? Her commanding officers recognized her exceptional abilities and recommended her for specialized training programs. Sarah excelled in every course, from advanced combat techniques to psychological warfare tactics. She became an instructor herself, teaching other soldiers the very skills that had made her so effective. Her classes were always full, and her students learned quickly that underestimating their instructor was a mistake they would only make once. The invitation to Fort Bragg came on a Tuesday morning. Sarah was cleaning her equipment after a training session when her commanding officer approached with an envelope marked with official seals. Inside was a request for her to participate in a special demonstration at one of the military's most prestigious training facilities. The event would showcase various combat techniques to an audience of elite Special Forces personnel from different branches of the military. Sarah accepted without hesitation. She had heard about Fort Bragg and knew that being invited to demonstrate there was a significant honor. What she didn't know was that she would be facing some of the most arrogant and dismissive attitudes she had ever encountered in her military career. The facility at Fort Bragg was impressive. State-of-the-art training equipment filled massive warehouses, and the grounds were meticulously maintained. When Sarah arrived, she was greeted by Colonel James Harrison, the officer in charge of the demonstration. He was professional but seemed surprised by her appearance. "You're Sergeant Martinez?" he asked, looking down at his clipboard and then back at her. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, standing at attention. "I have to admit, I was expecting someone," he paused, searching for the right words, "different." Sarah had heard variations of this comment throughout her career. She simply nodded and asked about the schedule for the demonstration. Colonel Harrison explained that several instructors would be showcasing different combat techniques throughout the day. Sarah would be demonstrating hand-to-hand combat skills in the afternoon session. As Sarah toured the facility, she became aware of the looks and whispers following her. Groups of soldiers would stop talking when she passed, then resume their conversations in hushed tones. She caught fragments of their discussions. Words like, "really?" and "her," and "must be a mistake." The doubt in their voices was thick enough to cut with a knife. The morning sessions went smoothly. Various instructors demonstrated weapons training, tactical maneuvers, and survival techniques. The audience, consisting of Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Green Berets, and other elite forces, was engaged and respectful. Sarah watched from the sidelines, studying the crowd and noting the dynamics between different units. During the lunch break, Sarah overheard a conversation that made her blood boil. A group of Navy SEALs was sitting at a table near where she was eating her meal. Their voices carried across the dining area as they discussed the morning's demonstrations. "Did you see who's supposed to teach hand-to-hand combat this afternoon?" one of them said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Yeah, that little girl who was walking around this morning." Another replied with a laugh. "What's she going to show us? How to slap someone?" Sarah looked up from her food and made eye contact with the speaker. He was tall, muscular, and wore the confident expression of someone who had never been challenged. His name tag read Rodriguez, and his demeanor screamed superiority complex. "I heard she's some kind of instructor," Rodriguez continued, still speaking loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Must be teaching kindergarten combat techniques." More laughter followed. Other tables began to pay attention to the conversation. Sarah felt the familiar fire building in her chest, the same feeling that had driven her through every challenge in her military career. But she remained seated, finishing her lunch calmly while mentally preparing for what was about to happen. Rodriguez stood up from his table and walked over to where Sarah was sitting. He towered over her, his shadow blocking out the fluorescent lights above. Several of his teammates followed, creating a small crowd around Sarah's table. "Hey there," Rodriguez said in a condescending tone. "I heard you're going to be teaching us some combat moves this afternoon. I have to ask, and don't take this the wrong way, but are you sure you're in the right place? Maybe there's been some kind of mix-up." Sarah looked up at him without changing her expression. She had faced this type of challenge countless times before, and she knew exactly how to handle it. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. Even standing, she barely reached Rodriguez's chest, but her presence seemed to fill the space around them. "No mix-up," she said simply. Rodriguez grinned and looked back at his teammates, who were now openly snickering. "Well, I'll tell you what. Why don't we have a little preview of your demonstration right now? I mean, we're all here. We're all curious. What do you say?" The dining hall had gone quiet. Every eye in the room was focused on the confrontation. Sarah could feel the weight of their expectations, their doubts, their assumptions about what was about to happen. She had two choices: walk away and let Rodriguez's comments stand, or accept his challenge and prove herself in front of the entire group. Sarah looked around the room, taking in the faces of the men who would be her students in just a few hours. She saw skepticism, amusement, and barely concealed disrespect. These were supposed to be the military's finest, yet they were behaving like schoolyard bullies. "All right," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent dining hall. "Let's do this." Rodriguez's grin widened. He had expected her to back down, maybe make an excuse about proper training environments or safety protocols. Her acceptance of his challenge caught him off guard, but he quickly recovered his composure. "Great," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Don't worry, I'll go easy on you." Sarah almost smiled at that comment, but she kept her expression neutral. She had heard those same words from dozens of opponents over the years. They always said they would go easy on her. right up until the moment they found themselves flat on their backs, wondering what had just happened. The crowd began to move, forming a circle around an open area of the dining hall. Chairs and tables were quickly pushed aside to create a makeshift training mat. The excitement in the room was palpable. Here was unexpected entertainment, a chance to see the cocky seal put the presumptuous instructor in her place. Rodriguez stepped into the center of the circle, bouncing on his toes and loosening his shoulders. He was clearly in his element, performing for his audience. He had probably been in dozens of similar situations, using his size and strength to dominate smaller opponents. This would be easy, he thought to himself. Sarah entered the circle with none of Rodriguez's showmanship. She moved with quiet confidence, her steps measured and purposeful. She positioned herself across from him and assumed a relaxed fighting stance. To the untrained eye, she looked almost casual, but those with real combat experience would have noticed the perfect balance in her posture, the readiness in her muscles, the calculating look in her eyes. "You sure about this, sweetheart?" Rodriguez asked, still playing to the crowd. "Last chance to back out gracefully." Sarah's response was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the silent room. "Make your move." Rodriguez shrugged and stepped forward, his hands raised in a basic fighting position. He was still grinning, still playing the role of the confident victor. He threw a lazy jab in Sarah's direction, more of a test than a real attack. Sarah slipped the punch easily, moving just enough to avoid contact. "Come on," Rodriguez said, his voice taking on a slightly mocking tone. "You can do better than that. Fight back a little." What happened next took place so quickly that many in the crowd weren't sure exactly what they had witnessed. Rodriguez threw another punch, this one with more commitment behind it. Sarah moved like water, flowing around his attack and using his forward momentum against him. In one fluid motion, she grabbed his extended arm, pivoted on her heel, and used a perfectly executed hip throw to send Rodriguez flying through the air. The sound of his body hitting the floor echoed through the dining hall like a gunshot. Rodriguez landed hard on his back, the wind knocked completely out of his lungs. He lay there gasping, trying to process what had just happened. The cocky grin was gone, replaced by shock and confusion. The dining hall was dead silent. 250 of the world's most elite warriors sat frozen, staring at the scene before them. The tiny instructor stood over the fallen Navy SEAL, not even breathing hard, while Rodriguez struggled to catch his breath on the floor. Sarah looked down at Rodriguez with an expression of mild concern. "You okay?" she asked, extending a hand to help him up. Rodriguez stared at her offered hand for a moment, his face cycling through emotions, embarrassment, anger, and finally grudging respect. He accepted her help and got to his feet, brushing dust off his uniform. "That was," he started to say, then stopped, searching for words. "Unexpected?" Sarah suggested. Rodriguez nodded slowly. "Yeah, unexpected." The spell was broken, and conversation erupted throughout the dining hall. Soldiers who had been dismissive just minutes earlier were now looking at Sarah with new eyes. The demonstration that was supposed to humiliate her had instead established her credibility in the most dramatic way possible. Colonel Harrison, who had witnessed the entire exchange from across the room, approached the group. His expression was unreadable as he looked from Sarah to Rodriguez and back again. "Well," he said finally, "I think we can all agree that this afternoon's demonstration is going to be very interesting." Word of what had happened in the dining hall spread through Fort Bragg like wildfire. By the time the afternoon session was scheduled to begin, the training facility was packed beyond capacity. Soldiers who weren't originally scheduled to attend the demonstration had found reasons to be there. Others had called friends from different units, urging them to witness what promised to be an unforgettable event. Sarah spent the time between lunch and her demonstration in quiet preparation. She found a small, empty classroom where she could stretch and center herself mentally. This wasn't just about physical technique anymore. It had become about proving that merit and skill mattered more than preconceived notions and physical appearance. The weight of representation sat heavily on her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for herself, but for every woman who had ever been dismissed or underestimated in a male-dominated field. As she moved through her warm-up routine, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. Every challenge she had faced, every doubt she had overcome, every hour of training she had endured, had led to this afternoon. She thought about her father, who had taught her that strength came in many forms, and her mother, who had worried but ultimately supported her unconventional choices. She thought about the female soldiers who would come after her and hoped that today might make their journey a little easier. Meanwhile, in the main training facility, the atmosphere was electric. The standard demonstration setup had been modified to accommodate the larger-than-expected crowd. Additional seating had been brought in, and standing room areas were marked off around the perimeter of the training mat. Conversations buzzed throughout the space as soldiers shared their versions of the lunchtime incident, each telling slightly embellishing the story with each retelling. Rodriguez sat with his SEAL teammates, noticeably quieter than he had been that morning. His earlier bravado had been replaced by a thoughtful silence that his colleagues found unsettling. When questioned about what had happened, he simply shook his head and said, "Just wait and see." Colonel Harrison took his position at the front of the training area and called for attention. The noise level dropped immediately as 250 elite soldiers focused on their commanding officer. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice carrying easily throughout the facility. "This afternoon we have the privilege of learning from Sergeant Sarah Martinez, a specialist in hand-to-hand combat and tactical operations. Sergeant Martinez has extensive field experience and has been recognized multiple times for her exceptional skills in close-quarters combat." As Harrison spoke, Sarah entered the training area through a side door. She had changed into her standard training uniform, simple military fatigues and lightweight combat boots. She looked even smaller against the backdrop of the massive facility, but her posture and movement conveyed absolute confidence. The crowd's attention shifted to her immediately, and the buzz of conversation died to a whisper. "I understand that some of you may have questions about Sergeant Martinez's qualifications," Harrison continued, and Sarah caught the hint of amusement in his voice. "I encourage you to keep an open mind and focus on the techniques being demonstrated. You might learn something valuable." Sarah stepped onto the training mat and faced the assembled crowd. For a moment, she simply stood there, letting her gaze move across the faces before her. She saw skepticism, curiosity, respect, and in some cases, outright hostility. The diversity of reactions didn't surprise her. She had learned to read crowds over years of teaching and demonstration. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice strong and clear without being loud. "Today, we're going to explore some fundamental principles of hand-to-hand combat that can be applied regardless of your size, strength, or physical advantages. The techniques we'll cover are based on leverage, timing, and understanding your opponent's center of gravity and momentum." She paused, letting her words sink in. Several soldiers in the front rows leaned forward slightly, their interest piqued by her professional demeanor and confident delivery. "Combat isn't always about being the biggest or strongest person in the fight," Sarah continued. "It's about being the smartest, the most prepared, and the most adaptable. Today, I'm going to show you how to turn your opponent's advantages into weaknesses and how to use physics and technique to overcome seemingly impossible odds." She gestured toward the crowd. "I'm going to need volunteers for these demonstrations. I know some of you might be hesitant to volunteer, especially given what happened at lunch." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd, and Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "But I promise you'll learn more by participating than by just watching." The first volunteer was an Army Ranger sergeant who stood about 6 feet tall and had the build of someone who spent serious time in the gym. He introduced himself as Davis and admitted that he was curious about the techniques Sarah had mentioned. Sarah appreciated his straightforward approach and professional attitude. "Sergeant Davis," Sarah said, "I want you to grab my wrist and hold on tight. Use your strength advantage. Don't let me go." Davis wrapped his large hand around Sarah's wrist, his fingers easily overlapping. He held firm, using enough pressure to demonstrate his strength without causing pain. Sarah tested his grip briefly, nodding approvingly. "Notice how Sergeant Davis has a significant strength advantage here," Sarah explained to the crowd. "Traditional thinking would suggest that I need to be stronger than him to break free. But watch what happens when I use technique instead of strength." Sarah's movement was so smooth and efficient that it almost seemed effortless. Instead of pulling directly against Davis's grip, she moved her arm in a small circle, finding the weak point in his hold where his thumb and fingers met. In one quick motion, she twisted her wrist and stepped slightly to the side. breaking free from his grasp completely. Davis looked down at his empty hand with surprise. "I was holding on pretty tight," he said. "You were," Sarah agreed. "But every grip has a weak point. It's not about overpowering the grip. It's about understanding the mechanics and finding the vulnerability." She demonstrated the technique again, this time more slowly, explaining each step and the reasoning behind it. The crowd was attentive now, the earlier skepticism beginning to fade as they recognized the practical value of what Sarah was teaching. Several soldiers were taking notes, and she could see others mentally rehearsing the movements she had shown. For the next technique, Sarah called for a larger volunteer, a Marine Lance Corporal, who stood nearly 6.5 feet tall and weighed at least twice as much as Sarah, stepped forward. His name was Johnson, and he moved with the slightly awkward gait of someone who was still growing into his impressive frame. "Johnson, I want you to grab me in a bear hug from behind," Sarah instructed. "Use your size advantage. Lift me off the ground if you can." Johnson positioned himself behind Sarah and wrapped his massive arms around her torso, lifting her feet completely off the mat. The size difference was so dramatic that several people in the crowd shook their heads in disbelief. There was no way Sarah could escape from such a hold, they thought. "This is a common attack scenario," Sarah said, her voice calm despite being completely immobilized. "The attacker uses their size and strength to control and intimidate. Most people would panic in this situation and try to struggle against the hold, which only tires them out and makes the attacker's job easier." While she spoke, Sarah demonstrated the escape technique. Instead of struggling against Johnson's arms, she tucked her chin down and used her elbows to create space. Then, in one coordinated movement, she dropped her weight, stepped to the side, and used a pressure point technique to force Johnson to release his grip. She spun around and had him in a control hold before he fully realized what had happened. Johnson blinked in confusion as he found himself with his arm twisted behind his back in Sarah's firm grip. "How did you do that?" he asked. "Physics and pressure points," Sarah replied, releasing him gently. "Your size gave you an initial advantage, but it also made you slower to react when I changed the dynamics of the situation." She walked Johnson through the technique step by step, explaining how the pressure point she had used temporarily disrupted his nervous system's ability to maintain his grip strength. The scientific explanation fascinated the crowd, many of whom had never considered the neurological aspects of combat techniques. As the demonstration continued, Sarah's credibility grew with each technique she showed. Her explanations were clear and logical, her demonstrations were flawless, and her teaching style was engaging without being condescending. The soldiers began to see her not as an anomaly or a curiosity, but as a legitimate expert in her field. The turning point came when a Navy SEAL Chief Petty Officer named Thompson volunteered for a demonstration. Thompson was known throughout the Special Operations community as one of the toughest and most skilled fighters in the Navy. He had requested to volunteer specifically because he wanted to test Sarah's abilities against someone with advanced training. Chief Thompson has extensive combat experience and advanced martial arts training, Sarah announced to the crowd. This demonstration will show how these techniques work against a skilled opponent who knows what's coming. Thompson assumed a fighting stance that immediately revealed his expertise. His positioning was perfect, his balance was ideal, and his eyes never left Sarah's center of mass. This wasn't going to be like the previous demonstrations against larger but less technically skilled opponents. "Come at me however you want," Sarah told him. "Don't hold back." Thompson nodded and began to circle Sarah, looking for an opening. His footwork was precise, and his approach was methodical. When he finally attacked, it was with a combination of strikes that would have overwhelmed most opponents. Sarah's response was beautiful to watch. She flowed around Thompson's attacks like water, never directly opposing his force but redirecting it and using it against him. When she counterattacked, it was with surgical precision, targeting specific pressure points and using leverage to multiply her effectiveness. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds and ended with Thompson face down on the mat, his arm controlled in a joint lock that left him completely helpless. The facility erupted in applause. Even Thompson's fellow SEALs were clapping enthusiastically. Their earlier skepticism completely evaporated. Thompson tapped the mat to signal his submission, and Sarah immediately released the hold and helped him to his feet. "Outstanding technique," Thompson said, genuinely impressed. I've trained with some of the best fighters in the world, and that was world-class stuff. His endorsement meant everything to the crowd. If Chief Thompson, a respected veteran of countless missions and training programs, said Sarah's techniques were world-class, then they were world-class. The remaining doubters in the audience were converted in that moment. Sarah continued the demonstration for another hour, covering various scenarios and techniques. Each volunteer left the mat with a new appreciation for the complexity and effectiveness of her methods. More importantly, each demonstration reinforced the central message she was trying to convey, that skill, knowledge, and technique could overcome raw physical advantages. As the session wound down, Sarah asked if there were any final questions or requests for specific techniques. Rodriguez, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since the lunch incident, raised his hand. "Sergeant Martinez," he said, standing up in the crowd. "I want to apologize for my behavior earlier today. I made assumptions based on appearances, and I was wrong. Would you be willing to show that Fro used on me but slower so people can see exactly how it works?" Sarah nodded approvingly. "Of course, but this is an attacking area having dinner with more." "And thank you for the apology, Sergeant Rodriguez. That takes courage." Rodriguez stepped onto the mat and Sarah walked through the hip throw technique in slow motion, explaining each component and the timing involved. She emphasized how she had used his forward momentum and higher center of gravity against him, turning his size advantage into a disadvantage. "The key," she explained, "is not to fight against your opponent's strength, but to redirect it." Rodriguez was moving forward with confidence and momentum. Instead of stopping that momentum, I simply changed its direction. She demonstrated the throw again at full speed, and once again Rodriguez found himself on the mat. This time, however, he was laughing as he got back to his feet. "Now that I know what to look for, I can see exactly how you did it," he said. "Brilliant technique." Colonel Harrison stepped forward as the demonstration concluded. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can all agree that Sergeant Martinez has provided us with some valuable insights to her expertise is clearly legitimate, and her teaching ability is exceptional. I hope you'll all take these lessons back to your units and share them with your colleagues." The applause that followed was genuine and enthusiastic. Soldiers approached Sarah individually to ask specific questions, request additional training opportunities, and simply to express their appreciation for what they had learned. The transformation in their attitudes was complete and remarkable. As the crowd began to disperse, Thompson approached Sarah privately. "Sergeant," he said, "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone combine technical skill with teaching ability the way you do. Have you ever considered applying for special operations training? We could use someone with your abilities." Sarah smiled at the compliment. "I appreciate that, Chief. Right now, I'm focused on training and education, but who knows what the future holds." Rodriguez also approached as Sarah was gathering her equipment. "Listen," he said, "I know I was a jerk earlier, but I learned something important today. Would you be willing to do some training sessions with my unit? I think we could all benefit from learning these techniques." "I'd be happy to," Sarah replied. "Just coordinate through your chain of command." As Sarah left the facility that evening, she reflected on the day's events. What had started as a routine demonstration had become something much more significant. She had not only proven her abilities to a room full of skeptics, but had also opened minds and challenged assumptions about what made an effective warrior. The ripple effects of that afternoon would be felt for years to come, as the soldiers who witnessed her demonstration carried the story and the lessons back to their units around the world. Sarah had accomplished something that went far beyond teaching combat techniques. She had changed how an entire generation of elite soldiers thought about strength, skill, and the importance of keeping an open mind. But as significant as that afternoon was, Sarah knew that the real test of her impact would come in the days and weeks that followed, as the soldiers applied what they had learned and shared their new perspectives with others. The demonstration had been just the beginning of a much larger conversation about merit, capability, and the dangers of making assumptions based on appearance. The morning after the demonstration, Sarah woke up to find 17 messages on her phone. Word of what had happened at Fort Bragg had spread far beyond the walls of the training facility. and requests for her expertise were pouring in from military units across the country. What she didn't know was that several of the soldiers who had witnessed her demonstration had recorded portions of it on their phones and shared the footage with colleagues around the world. Colonel Harrison called her into his office first thing that morning. He was sitting behind his desk with a stack of papers and expression that Sarah couldn't quite read. "Sergeant Martinez," he began, "I've been fielding calls since 6 this morning. It seems that word of yesterday's demonstration has reached some very high places in the military hierarchy. I have requests here from 3 different Special Operations Commands, the Naval War College, and the Army's new Integrated Combat Training Program." He paused and looked directly at her. "I have to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. When you accepted the invitation to demonstrate here, did you know this would happen? Did you plan for this to become such a significant event?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Sir, I came here to do my job and share some techniques that I thought might be useful. I didn't plan for the confrontation at lunch, and I certainly didn't expect the level of interest that followed. I just responded to the situation as it developed." Harrison nodded slowly. "That's what I thought. Which makes what happened even more impressive." He leaned forward in his chair. "Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you. What happened yesterday was extraordinary, not just because of your technical skills, but because of how you handled yourself under pressure and how you turned a potentially negative situation into a teaching moment." He picked up one of the papers from his desk. "This is a request from the Pentagon Special Operations Command. They want you to develop a new training curriculum based on the techniques you demonstrated yesterday. This is a career-changing opportunity." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The Pentagon Special Operations Command was the pinnacle of military training and strategic planning. Being asked to develop curriculum for them was an honor that few soldiers ever received. "There's more," Harrison continued. "I've also received informal inquiries from several allied nations. Apparently, some foreign military observers were present yesterday, and they were impressed enough to request training opportunities with their forces." Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself at the center of a whirlwind of activity that she had never anticipated. The video footage from her demonstration had somehow made its way onto military training websites and social media platforms. While the military generally controlled such content carefully, the footage had been shared so widely within professional circles that containing it became impossible. The response was overwhelmingly positive, but it also brought challenges that Sarah hadn't expected. She began receiving messages from female soldiers around the world who had faced similar challenges and discrimination. Many shared stories of being underestimated or dismissed because of their gender or size. Sarah realized that her demonstration had become symbolic of something much larger than combat techniques. Rodriguez, the SEAL who had initially challenged her, became one of her most vocal advocates. He had requested that Sarah conduct a full day of training with his unit, and the session had been so successful that other SEAL teams began making similar requests. Rodriguez later admitted that the lesson he had learned that day went far beyond combat techniques. "I realized that I had been making assumptions about people based on what I could see on the surface," he told his commanding officer during his annual review. "Sarah taught me that real strength and capability come in forms that you might not expect. That's made me a better soldier and a better leader." Thompson, the SEAL chief who had volunteered for the advanced demonstration, became instrumental in helping Sarah develop her new curriculum. His endorsement carried significant weight within the special operations community, and his collaboration with Sarah on training methodology became a model for other programs. "What Sarah brings to combat training is unique," Thompson explained to a gathering of special operations instructors. "She combines technical expertise with an understanding of human psychology and learning theory. She doesn't just teach techniques, she teaches people how to think differently about problems and solutions." The new curriculum that Sarah developed incorporated the lessons she had learned from years of being underestimated. She structured the training to challenge assumptions and force students to think beyond their preconceptions. The program became known for producing soldiers who were more adaptable, more creative in their problem solving, and more effective in unconventional situations. 6 months after the Fort Bragg demonstration, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. The caller identified himself as General Patricia Williams, one of the highest-ranking women in the military. General Williams had heard about Sarah's work and wanted to discuss a special assignment. "Sergeant Martinez, General Williams said. "I'm putting together a special task force focused on developing new approaches to military training and readiness. Based on what I've heard about your work, I believe you would be an invaluable addition to this team." The position would come with a promotion and would involve travel to military installations worldwide. Sarah accepted the position, which marked the beginning of a new phase in her career. Her work took her to bases in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, where she trained soldiers from dozens of different countries and military traditions. Each assignment taught her something new about combat, culture, and human nature. The impact of her training extended beyond individual soldiers. Military units that had gone through Sarah's programs reported improved performance in real-world situations. They showed better adaptability in unexpected circumstances, improved teamwork between soldiers of different backgrounds, and more innovative approaches to tactical challenges. One of the most significant developments came when Sarah was invited to address a gathering of military leaders from NATO countries. Her presentation, titled "Strength Beyond Appearance: Redefining Combat Effectiveness," challenged traditional military thinking about recruitment, training, and leadership selection. "We spend enormous resources identifying and training the most physically capable soldiers," she told the assembled generals and admirals. "But we often overlook other forms of strength that can be equally valuable in modern combat situations. Mental agility, emotional resilience, and the ability to think creatively under pressure are skills that don't always correlate with physical size or strength." Her presentation led to changes in military training programs across multiple countries. Recruitment strategies were modified to identify candidates with diverse skill sets. Training programs were updated to include psychological and tactical flexibility components. And leadership development programs began to emphasize adaptability over traditional command and control approaches. The story of the demonstration at Fort Bragg became a case study in military academies and training institutions around the world. It was used to teach lessons about leadership, assumption-making, and the importance of maintaining open minds in professional environments. Sarah often received invitations to speak at these institutions, where she shared not just the techniques that had made her famous, but the broader lessons about perseverance, professionalism, and the dangers of prejudice. Years later, Sarah would encounter soldiers who had been in the audience that day at Fort Bragg. Many would tell her that the demonstration had changed their perspectives not just about combat, but about how they evaluated people and situations in all areas of their lives. They had learned to look beyond surface appearances and to value competence over conformity. Rodriguez, who had become a close friend and colleague, often accompanied Sarah on training missions. His transformation from skeptic to advocate had made him particularly effective at reaching soldiers who struggled with similar biases. He had a unique ability to connect with those who, like his former self, made assumptions based on appearance. "I tell them the same thing Sarah told me that day," Rodriguez would say during training sessions. "Don't judge what someone can do based on what you think you see. Judge them based on what they actually do." The techniques Sarah had demonstrated that day at Fort Bragg were eventually incorporated into standard military training curricula worldwide. But more importantly, the broader lessons about merit, capability, and open-mindedness became part of military culture in ways that extended far beyond combat training. Sarah's career continued to flourish, and she eventually achieved the rank of colonel before transitioning to civilian life. She established a consulting firm that worked with military organizations, law enforcement agencies, and corporate clients on training programs that emphasized skill development, leadership, and diversity of thinking. Looking back on that pivotal day at Fort Bragg, Sarah often reflected on how a simple demonstration had grown into something much larger than she had ever imagined. The confrontation with Rodriguez, which could have been a negative experience, had instead become the catalyst for positive change that affected thousands of people around the world. The story became more than just a tale of physical prowess overcoming prejudice. It became a reminder that excellence comes in many forms, and that the most effective organizations are those that recognize and value diverse forms of strength and capability. The woman who had walked into that dining hall as an unknown instructor had walked out as a symbol of what was possible when skill, determination, and opportunity intersected. In her retirement, Sarah established a foundation that provided training and mentorship opportunities for young women entering military and law enforcement careers. She wanted to ensure that future generations would face fewer barriers and encounter less skepticism than she had experienced. The Foundation's motto, inscribed on a plaque in Sarah's office, read simply, "Merit has no size limit." The dining hall at Fort Bragg eventually received a historical marker commemorating the events that had taken place there. It served as a reminder to future generations of soldiers that assumptions could be dangerous, that skill came in many forms, and that sometimes the most important lessons came from the most unexpected teachers. Rodriguez, who had eventually become a training instructor himself, would often bring his students to see the marker. "This is where I learned one of the most important lessons of my career," he would tell them. "A 5'4" woman taught me that strength isn't about size. It's about skill, knowledge, and the courage to prove yourself when others doubt you." The story of that day continued to inspire soldiers, law enforcement officers, and civilians around the world who faced their own battles against prejudice and underestimation. It reminded them that capability wasn't determined by appearance, that excellence demanded recognition regardless of the package it came in, and that sometimes the most powerful victories were won not on battlefields, but in the moments when someone chose to stand up and prove that merit mattered more than assumptions. Sarah's legacy extended far beyond the techniques she had taught or the training programs she had developed. She had shown an entire generation of military professionals that strength came in many forms, that expertise deserved respect regardless of its source, and that the most dangerous mistake a warrior could make was to underestimate an opponent based on appearance alone. The woman who had once been dismissed as too small to be effective had become one of the most influential figures in modern military training. Her story served as a powerful reminder that in a world where first impressions often determined opportunities, the most important victories were sometimes won by those who looked least likely to succeed.